This is Heidi Yewman with Behind the Bullet Film, and you're listening to So Booking Cool with Jewel B.
Welcome to So Booking Cool. It's Jewel B. Today's guest recently had a screening at the Slam Dance Film Festival as an acclaimed feature documentary competition film for her directorial debut, Behind the Bullet. She is Heidi Yewman.
Hi.
Hi, Heidi. Welcome to So Booking Cool. I'm excited to talk to you today. How is
Great.
everything?
Great to be here. Thank you.
Of course. Now, you did write Beyond the Bullet, the book. There's a book version, Personal Stories of Gun Violence Aftermath. Now, what led to you turning this into a feature film?
So the book and the film are actually very different. So the book is a series of 19 stories of people who've been impacted by gun violence. So it's people who either lost a loved one to gun violence or they had been shot and survived. And so they tell their stories in their own words. And I was really interested in this topic, and it became apparent that I wanted to know, well, what happens to you when you're on the other side of the gun and you shoot somebody? How does that impact you? Because that was the question I was trying to answer with the book. What happens if how do you get out of bed the next day after you find out that your son had been murdered, for instance? So I wanted to find out what happens to you after you shoot somebody. And I was planning on writing another book, but it became really apparent to me that it's much more complicated. The people in the book, a lot of them went to support groups. They found help, was dealing with tremendous loss. But when you shoot somebody and kill them, there's not a support group. And there's a complexity of loss, especially if it's somebody that you know, like an accidental death where you shoot a family member accidentally, for instance. There's that complexity, and then there's loss and guilt and shame. And so I felt like the nonverbals, when people were talking about what happened, the nonverbals I wouldn't have been able to connect to in a book form. So I felt like film was a better medium.
Wow, that's so compelling. What do you find are the most common types of shootings? Like ones that are accidental, ones that's incidental? Like, what would you say, Heidi?
Well, actually, with gun deaths, over 60% of gun deaths are suicide. It's the guns that are in our homes, which is like more than 300 million. Those guns that are taken by somebody who's in a distraught place, in a very scary moment, that's the biggest type of gun violence. And then after that, it's homicide, and then after that, accidental. But the vast majority is suicide, and so we address that in the film, that issue as well.
So at this screening that recently happened, what did you find was the reaction amongst the people? Like, how did they what did you notice about the crowd?
Yeah, so the reaction I'm getting, it's not a funny film for sure. I actually had a reporter comment on that. They said, so this is not a comedy. I said, no, it is not. People are surprised that they're watching a film, number one, that is not preaching to them. So oftentimes we'll watch a film about a social issue and we're sort of told what to think and what to do about it. And that is not what I wanted to do. I didn't want to preach to people. And then the second thing that I'm hearing after the screenings is people are surprised that I don't have a point of view that comes out strongly. And again, I did this on purpose, and so I'm really pleased that the audience is getting that. I think that if we're going to have a conversation about gun violence, I think we need to look at it holistically, and we need to stop trying to reduce the conversation into bumper stickers. So often we hear either you're a good guy or a bad guy with a gun, or you're pro-gun or you're anti-gun. And these conversations and the way we're talking about it it's not working and it's not helpful. And so I wanted to create a film that shows this complicating factor and really show the moral injury that happens when you shoot somebody, even if it's justified.
Yeah, you did take a look at an in-depth look at 4 individuals who have been on the side of pulling the trigger. How did you come across these individuals, and what was it like to work with them for this documentary?
Well, my first idea was I really was interested in the self-defense shooting. And so I found a guy actually on an NRA website who was touted as sort of this great hero because there was an intruder in his house and he shot and killed the guy that was in his house, ironically stealing his guns. And so he wasn't arrested and it was a justified shooting. But I show in the film, there's a lot of paranoia. Can't sleep at night. He's put tripwires around his property. And so it's really impacted him. And again, this idea of there's been a moral injury. And I think he's the best person in the film that really illustrates what I was talking about before. He talks about, I was justified. I was scared. My family and myself, we were at risk. I had to do what I had to do. But now there's these consequences. And I didn't anticipate those and didn't think that would happen. So I found a woman who was shot in the face and interviewed her with the ramifications of what happened with her. A boy who was 8 years old when he found his mom's gun and he accidentally shot and killed his little brother. Oh. And so I interviewed him 10 years after the shooting. And so he talks about how he and the family have dealt with the loss and the shame and the guilt. And how that family's been coping with that. And then a guy in Philadelphia who was shot at on the streets, he pulled out his gun and shot back. And then he actually went to prison for 10 years for murder and is now working really hard in Philadelphia to change the kind of culture that he grew up in and help out the youth of Philadelphia.
With this being your directorial debut, Heidi, how did you know, how to put the pieces together? Because this is such a powerful subject, and it really seems like you knew what you wanted, you knew what you had to do. Can you just tell us about, your insight and your background into having your debut film?
Yeah, so I basically came about it I've heard this over and over, and I did the same thing with my book. I wrote the book that I wanted to read. I wasn't seeing stories about gun violence victims when I wrote it, when it came out in 2007. I was finding these political books, but I wasn't seeing the stories. Mm-hmm. And then, so I wrote the book that I wanted to read, and then I did the same with the film. I wasn't able to find films that took a neutral stance on this issue that would invite conversation with gun owners and non-gun owners alike. And so I've always just been this kind of person that's curious about the people who aren't noticed. So when I see a shooting on TV, a mass shooting, I will often think of the families of the shooter and how this impacts them. And I don't know, maybe it goes back to when I was a little girl and I'd go feed the ducks and I'd always find the duck that wasn't being aggressive, trying to get the bread that I was putting out there. It was the little guy on the side that wasn't willing to fight for the stuff or the breadcrumbs. So maybe it goes way back, some psychological thing. But that's just where I come from. And I this is a part of the gun violence story that we don't hear about. When I started doing the research, I couldn't find newspaper articles. I couldn't find magazine articles or anything or TV shows about this side of the story. And I found it to be really compelling.
And have you ever filmed anything before? With a camera? Did you have to take a class or anything?
No, no. So my answer to that is I found this guy in Portland, Oregon, where I live, who is an incredible filmmaker, and he's done documentaries for the last 20 years. And in fact, he just had a short that was nominated for an Oscar called Lifeboat. So I partnered with him, and he brought the expertise of filmmaking and was actually one of the cameramen. And then I brought the expertise on gun violence, and then also on getting people to really open up and be vulnerable. And around that, a lot of the challenges that I faced doing this was about the time was mostly spent building the relationships with the people that we filmed. And so I spent a lot of time building trust because I hadn't even been on camera myself. I've never been in a film. And so I imagined it would be very difficult, especially to talk about something so tragic and so hard. And I felt like if I was going to ask these people to be on film with 2 cameras and bright lights, I felt like I was going to really need to get them to trust me in a really authentic way. And in fact, I think that worked, and I have gotten that feedback that comes out on film.
When did you find that the subjects started to trust you during the interview?
Well, most of them, one was in Philadelphia, one was in North Carolina, one was in Seattle, and one was in DC. And so I flew out to all of them and spent a long weekend, or the guy in Seattle, I went up there a couple different times. But I found that they trusted me before I brought cameras into the situation.
Oh.
And then there were follow-up phone calls, and in fact, I still am in contact with them, and I flew out to each of them this summer to show them the finished film, because I felt like they told me these really hard stories, and they trusted me, and I felt like it was really important that they were able to see the film before any of the public saw it. And again, I think they appreciated that, and they all had, the other thing is I needed to give them some context. So, if I filmed for 35 hours for one person, because we filmed their family and their doctor and their minister and their everybody, and then had to squish basically those 35 hours into 20 minutes. So I felt like I needed to give them some context to explain, like, why wasn't my minister in this, or why wasn't my best friend in it for more than a soundbite, that kind of thing. So, but I just really felt like I wanted to honor their trust.
Was the editing process intense? Like, did you find that you had to often say, I don't have enough space or room, but this is all such great footage, I wish I could include all of it?
Oh, yeah, totally. Oh, absolutely. Also, because the stories are so dynamic, there's so many different ways I could have gone with it. And so it was my editor and myself and my co-producer. We would have these very heated debates on what we should include and what we shouldn't, and went back to it several times. And it was a really important part of the process to make sure that what we have in there is what we actually wanted to have in there. Because part of it is I wanted to be honest with them. I wanted to be honest with the audience, but I also didn't want to throw anybody under the bus, which I've seen happen before in films and documentaries. So I wasn't willing to cut corners and tell an untruth or make somebody look better than they are or worse than they are, in order to be dramatic about it. And so I think we found a really nice balance.
Okay. And Heidi, I'm curious to know, what do you mean, just for like more context, I would love to hear more about the throwing under the bus.
Oh, right. So, let me see, if somebody were talking about, so there's a scene in there where one of the boy who accidentally shot his little brother.
Right.
He likes to work with pyrotechnics with his friends, and I didn't want to make him seem somehow more agitated than he is, and I could have done that for dramatic effect, but that wasn't my goal, and so I needed to be honest with the audience and show like this is who he is and this is what he does now, and so that kind of thing.
What did you find, because you mentioned that you did bring the film before it was released to the to audiences. You showed the four subjects the film. Did you watch it with them? And I just want to know, like, what was that like?
Yeah, so Will Little, who is the guy who shot somebody on the streets of Philadelphia, I sat down with him, and he had his mom and his sister with him, and it was really interesting because he really liked it, and he because it's not just his story, it's intertwined with three other people's stories. I think that he found that to be compelling and sort of picks up on different themes of sort of forgiveness of self. And his mom had a really hard time watching him talk about the shooting in the film, and she actually had to leave the room. And then what was really interesting is then after the film, we sat around, and for like an hour, he and his two sisters, he and his two sisters and his mom, they talked about what that was like for them, and what did it feel like when he got arrested? What did it feel like when he was in jail? And then he said to his mom, Mom, like, you kept coming to jail telling me I didn't do it, and I knew I couldn't move forward and I couldn't work on myself if I was denying that I did it. And so the conversation went of, well, I didn't believe you could do something like that. And so there was like, I wanted to film that moment that they had together, because they hadn't really talked and dealt with the feelings that they had in that moment until I sat down with them to show them the film.
Heidi, that you know of, is it common for the director to want to extend the courtesy to have the people who have been a part of the film to watch it first and to just have a dialogue with it like you have done?
I don't think so. My husband is a recovering journalist, and he and I had a bunch of discussions about this. And so he said, well, they signed a release form, right? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, then what's the problem? Like, why do you need to show it to them? And so he had this very different opinion, and I think a lot of filmmakers do worry about that. And I could see that becoming an issue depending on the film that you're doing, where you would worry about, well, if I show it to this person, then they're not going to, if they don't like it, then am I liable for a lawsuit or that kind of thing. And so, but that wasn't my concern, because I felt like I had worked really hard to be honest and to tell the truth, and in the way that I saw it. And also I think by giving people the dignity to be able to see their life, and then to be able to ask you questions about why you did certain things and why you portrayed them in certain ways, I think that made them more, it made them feel respected, which is ultimately what I wanted to do. The last thing I wanted to do was to re-traumatize anybody through this process.
Yeah. So what advice can you give to the filmmaker, whether they are seasoned or aspiring, and they want to make a film that is based on something that is so powerful and such a serious topic?
I do think part of it is, as a filmmaker, and I don't think this is talked a lot about in the industry, I think it's really important that filmmakers take care of themselves emotionally. So when I'm interviewing somebody, and I found this true when I was interviewing for the book as well, you're taking on a lot of energy, and you're seeing this trauma being told to you, and you can't help but take on that energy. And so I found coping mechanisms throughout the process of, like, if I just take on this energy and this sadness and it just stays with me, like, it's going to crush me. And so I ended up finding ways for instance, when I would get done with an interview, I would go in my car, drive away a few blocks, and then just cry. And that's how it works for me. I don't know that crying works for everybody, but I found I just needed to like let out all these feelings that I was having and just feel for this person. And so that helped me take care of myself emotionally so that then I could go on to the next one and I could do the next interview and be really present and not be crushed by their sadness.
Can we expect another film from you? Because it definitely sounds like you have a future in this.
Well, yeah, I have been thinking about it a little bit, and my focus right now is so much on this film, but I do like the gun violence world and telling those stories. I think there's so much to learn from that, and especially in America when we have such an issue with it. And I think so doing a sort of a episodic series, I've been playing with that idea because the people featured in this film are just regular people who have guns for self-protection. And so I didn't include any military or police or security guards or anybody like that because I wanted to tell the layman's story. And so I could see possibly doing an episodic series with other situations. And unfortunately in America we have just too many of these kinds of stories. So there's unfortunately so many stories out there that should and could be told.
Mm-hmm. Are you interested in sticking with the stories on, gun stories in which it might be accidental or self-defense, or is that what you want to stick with, or you do want to explore other types of shootings?
Yeah. At one point, I looked into interviewing, cops who had shot somebody in the line of duty. I talked to some military people who'd shot somebody, when they were in Iraq or that kind of thing. So I'm sort of up for stories that I think are not necessarily being told.
Right.
That's what interests me. It's like this kind of side part. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, Heidi. It does. With Behind the Bullet, this amazing film definitely definitely sounds like a must watch, Heidi.
I think it's important I think it's important for the conversation that we need to have. And again, I made this for not just people who would be, I don't know, considered anti-gun, but I made this for people who have guns in their homes for self-defense because they love their families and they love their kids and they want to protect them, but trying to make everybody think a little bit about what those guns are doing, especially around suicide.
Wow, and on that note, Heidi Yewman, everyone. Heidi, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you. I'm so glad that you created this film. It's a powerful message, and I like that you're putting light on something that doesn't get talked about often. How can people keep up with you and watch Behind the Bullet, as well as information on the book?
Yeah, so we're working on distribution right now, and keeping everybody updated. I've got a couple film festivals coming up, one in Texas, in Dallas, and then one in Tampa, Florida. The best way to find out about what's going on and when we'll have our commercial release will be by going to our website, behindthebulletfilm.com. Mm-hmm. And then we're also on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, so there's all those, and that's all, you can find out all that stuff on the website.
And those social media handles are also Behind the Bullet?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much to all the listeners, and until next time, so booking cool.
This is Heidi Yewman with Behind the Bullet Film, and you're listening to So Booking Cool with Jewel B.